Greetings to you. This is the China Studies Center. We'll be starting very shortly. Please will you wait whilst participants sign on to the webinar. We will be starting shortly. Please be patient whilst we allow participants to join the webinar. Greetings to you. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney in Australia. Before we begin, may I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the university is based, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We recognise their traditions and their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today's webinar is to be given by Professor Bjorn Alpermann from the University of Würzburg, who will talk about China's population policy, but more importantly, the politics of the population policy and how the conceptual understandings of that have shaped what has become the population policy now. The moderator for today's session will be Professor Yingjie Guo, and I'm going to hand over to him in a minute. Before I do that, though, may I ask you if you have questions that you wish to pose or comments you wish to make for the end of the presentation, towards the end, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom software. And the moderator will then read out the questions from there to put to Professor Alpermann. Okay, over to you, Professor Guo.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Bjorn Alpermann today. Welcome, everybody. Bjorn Alpermann holds an MA in Modern Chinese Studies, Political Science, and Economics. He also holds a PhD in Modern Chinese Studies, both earned at the University of Cologne. Since 2008, he has been teaching and researching at the Julius Maximilian University of Würzburg, first as an assistant professor, later on since 2013 as full professor and chair of contemporary Chinese studies. He has published widely on a number of topics regarding Chinese politics and society, such as local administration, state and society relations, and population issues, which he is going to talk about today. He is currently the speaker of the Joint Center for Advanced Studies, World-Making from a Global Perspective, a dialogue with China, which is funded by the German Federal Ministry of Research and Education. So I'm looking forward to your webinar, Professor Alpermann.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and organization, as well as the kind introduction. I'd like to share my screen to get started. Yeah, I'd like to first apologize to the organizers that I slightly changed the title of my presentation for today. I'm still in the process of revising this paper, and so, you know, change happens. So it's now called Social Categorizations and Population Discourses in China's Era of Aging. And I'm co-authoring this together with a former PhD student of mine, Weiyue Yang. And now it's not working. Wait a second. Let me share. Okay, so a little bit on the background before I get into this paper. It is determined to be part of a special issue that is coming out of a workshop we did a while ago on social categories and governance in China. So what I'm interested in here is how the ways academics talk and write about certain population issues, how these are then influencing governmental policies and policy making. So I'm looking at academic discourses in order to understand what makes Chinese politics tick. And here I would like to introduce an idea that I'm thinking about and that I hope I can substantiate. Namely, that there is a kind of loose coupling between academic and policy discourses, especially in China. We all know that Chinese policymaking is less than transparent. Some even like to talk about a black box of Chinese policymaking. And so therefore, it is important for us to find avenues how to study policymaking processes from the outside without being able to look into that so-called black box. And the idea I want to propose here, more as a hypothesis or as a premise of the research, is that we can get insights into this by looking at academic discourses, even though, and I fully admit that, it is often impossible to draw direct links of causation. Academic A said this, and then policies include this idea later on. Because very often it can be the other way around. A politician comes up with an idea, or at least with a term, and then farms out the meaning making, what this term is supposed to mean, to academics via tenders for projects. And then academics come up with clever ideas what this term could mean. And part of those ideas generated by the academic community might then be incorporated into policymaking. So we can never really say exactly where the process starts and how it's going to end. But the idea that I want to put forward is to understand these two spheres of academic and policymaking discourses as loosely coupled. So there is a linkage, even though we cannot directly draw causational lines. We have argued in other publications that the government in China in particular is heavily engaged in political steering. And one way or one mode of steering is steering via discourses. And especially in population policy, I think there are many prominent examples that are known from the past, especially the era of the one-child policy. Positive examples like the single-child families, 独生家庭, family planning families, 计划生育家庭, or double daughter families, 双女户, those who did not have a son, and also negative examples, of course, such as excess births, the 超生人口, or black children, 黑孩子, which is a more colloquial term, of course. So all of these and others like Susan Greenhalgh and Edwin Winkler and others have shown that the population policy field has been very productive in the sense of producing these terminologies and producing methods how to guide and steer population through discourses. We have also tried to substantiate this with other studies that I've been involved in. A paper on political steering in general that I did with Günter Schubert, another one specifically on population policies and political steering that I did with Zhang Shaohua, and another one with Franziska Fröhlich, in which there's a typo here, Fröhlich, which we are looking at the methodologies we can use in order to study the steering through discourses. And then we also did a study on the Shidu, the so-called bereaved single-child families, that was again co-authored with Yang Weiyue, in which we look at different levels of discourse or different discourse fields, official discourses on these families that usually don't use the term Shidu, then academic discourses that have promoted this term Shidu or bereaved single-child families, as well as finally counter discourses coming from the Shidu as a group themselves. So, for instance, as to be found in petitions that they bring forward. Now, with this paper, we want to advance our interest here by looking at two similar cases, so to say, two different terms that address a potentially problematic part of society, a quote-unquote problematic population group, the空巢, the empty nests, elderly, and the失独老人in particular, the elderly who have lost their single child. Turning to data and methods, we use the sociology of knowledge approach to discourse, abbreviated as SCUT, which was developed by a German sociologist called Reiner Keller. And this is based on the premise of social constructivism. So reality, social reality is seen as constructed by social actors, usually using their discourse statements. The focus of our interest is the question how knowledge about this particular field we're looking at is being produced. So what are the questions asked? What kind of data is being marshaled? What kind of blind spots can we identify, and so on and so forth. Just by way of definition, we define discourses as an institutionally regulated practice of sign usage, usually expressed in language, but can also include other signs, of course. And we understand knowledge production in discourses, of course, as a contested social process. So it's not a given what kind of language, what kind of knowledge is being acceptable, but rather this is exactly what is being discussed. So briefly put, at stake is the question, where does the power reside to define a legitimate interpretation of reality? So through what kind of arguments and through what kind of data can this be defended against others, potentially rivaling or even contradictory interpretations of reality? Again, briefly, just to mention that where we get our material from, very simply, we took the China Academic Journals database out of the CNKI network. And this chart here is just to present you the kind of the wealth of relevant articles that can be identified with these terms. Shidu and空巢老人, just in the title, we were looking at various articles from a broad range of sources. So we are following theoretical sampling principles. That is to say, we're not emphatically not trying to do a quantitative study here. So don't be fooled by the chart, but rather we are trying to find out what are the different positions taken by different authors in different types of journals using different terminology. So we're not just using these two terms here, but we're also following up on other related terms, trying to build a kind of landscape or reconstruct the landscape of the discourse and comparing these different positions rather than, so mapping it out basically, rather than weighing it. Yeah, so we're not saying this is the dominant position or this is a minor position. We're not trying to judge that quantitatively. We're just saying what are the positions out there and how are the positions legitimized? What are the substantiating arguments that are being made? And following the principles of SCUT analysis, we first look at the phenomenal structure, which has several sub-points. The first one, obviously, is definitions. So how do you define these two categories of groups, these social categorizations, the Shih and the空巢老人? Now, the Shih are often defined as single child families, so a couple with one child who have lost their child due to death, and subsequently did not have another child. Yeah, so you can think of situations in which a single child dies, but the couple is still young enough to have a second child, and then of course they would no longer be called 失独 in the Chinese discourse. More specifically, legal documents at a year, an age range for the mothers in these 失独 couples, and say only those above 49 can be eligible for certain kinds of social welfare for these particular cases. Now, definitions are, of course, very much at stake when it comes to social sciences. We always need clear boundaries of what we are talking about, what the phenomenon really is. And there are lots of discussions on this in the literature, because you can draw the boundary or the border between these categories in various ways. There are, for instance, authors who argue that there is also the situation of a single child that becomes incapacitated, whether due to an accident or illness or some other mishap, so that the child does not fulfill or can no longer fulfill the functions of supporting elderly parents. And these authors therefore suggest to include them in the 失独 category as so-called relative 失独 versus absolute 失独, those who have lost their child due to death. So the child is simply no longer there, to not just as a supporter giver, a caregiver, but no longer there as a person, as someone who can carry on the family name, and so on and so forth. You can also think of variations of this, for instance, a situation where an adult child has died, but has before death already procreated and produced a grandson or granddaughter, so that the family name can live on. That's, again, a different shade of gray, you could say, to the 失独 category. Yeah? So whether to include them or not include them, these are important questions. With respect to the 空巢, things become even more difficult, because 空巢 is less stark, meaning empty nest. That could mean the adult children have left the parents' home forever, moving to other places, for instance, so they're no longer around, some even going abroad, so at least for everyday purposes, they are no longer there. That would be considered a clear case of 空巢. But what about those where the adult children have moved out but still live in the vicinity, where they can check upon their elderly parents on a day-to-day basis, or where they plan to come back after a couple of years? So all of these questions are being debated, and they suggest that border drawing for these categories is quite difficult. And this also brings up the question of how much internal differentiation within the category is being allowed by different authors. So some would say, no, this is a clear-cut case of an outside of category person or couple. Others would say, no, this is part of the Kongchao or Shidu category. We should consider them also as part of that social category. We just have to imagine this as a more internally differentiated social group. So these questions of border drawing are connected to the question of how much internal differentiation do you allow, or whether you think of a social category only as a homogeneous, more or less homogeneous group. And I would like to call this a kind of containerization. If you go down this road of producing social categories that are clearly distinct, but do not allow for any overlaps, and are internally homogeneous, then you're basically creating a container. And you're suggesting, at least that is the effect, I would argue, that everybody in that container is more or less in the same social situation with the same needs and wants, and therefore needs the same kind of social welfare to deal with, cope with the situation. Also of interest is what are the blind spots, what is not being talked about, what is elided. So for instance, we find that in many of the contributions, the definition is so much focused on the question of is the child still around? Has it died, or is it just incapacitated, and so on? That what is often forgotten, also in empirical studies, is the question of whether we're talking about a Shidu or Kongchao couple or a Shidu or Kongchao individual. So arguably, we would say that it makes a great deal of difference for elderly people if they are living alone or as a couple, in terms of everyday care, but also, of course, in terms of keeping company and social support and so on. And that means the problematique is maybe not fully covered by these definitions. And the second important point I want to make is that most of the discussions surrounding these two groups are, when it comes to operationalization at least, focused on living arrangements. So many of the a lot of the knowledge that is being produced is based on empirical studies. And of course, for an empirical study, you need to define the target population and the frame population of your sample and so on. And you need to define who falls into a category or not. And that is most easily done by asking about living arrangements. So do the elderly live together with their children or not? And they do not usually use care arrangements. So they would not ask how often do your children come to visit, and do they take care of your daily errands, and do they do chores in the household and so on. But they would simply ask for living arrangements. And again, arguably, that is somewhat besides the point. I gave the example of a Kongchao elderly or Kongchao couple already. They might be living in the same city, even in the same neighborhood, or the same xiaoqu as the son or daughter who is grown up and has moved out. So there might be a lot of support, actually, for these elderly on a day-to-day basis by their adult children. And still they're being placed in this category of Kongchao. And others who may be living with their family may receive much less support, simply because, one of the spouses has migrated to another place and the other one is busy working at home. Especially the differences between urban and rural come to mind here. Obviously, the group size that you arrive at is heavily depending on the definitions that you're going to use. So I don't want to really go into depth on the different estimates of the group sizes, because that's tedious and doesn't get us anywhere. Let's just say it's heavily dependent on the definitions that you use. Although various authors try their best to come to good estimates, there are equally legitimate reasons to come to completely different estimates just by using different methods and a different understanding of the phenomenon in question. But what these discussions all share in common is that they highlight how large the problem is, irrespective of whether we're talking about 失独 or 空巢. It's always an emphasis on an urgency to act, and the prospect, and maybe I should have written that on the chart as well, and the prospect that it's getting much worse in the near future, and we already know that. Yeah, so there is always this urgency. We need to build up social structures of support. We need to expand social welfare payments and psychological counseling and so on and so forth for these particular groups, and an urgency to do so quite soon. Subsequently, we are looking at the question how the problem is being constructed by these authors. That is to say, what do they see as the primary factors that lead into this situation, that give rise to the existence of these groups? And here we find a very interesting difference between the two otherwise quite similar discourses. Namely, in the case of the 失独, the discourse is, at least in part, veering towards politicization. So before the lifting of the one child per couple rule, or first lessening the constriction and then lifting it finally in 2016, the 失独 issue was often used by critics of the one-child policy in order to point to the defects of that policy. So it was being politicized for a specific purpose, not just to help the 失独 couples in question, but also to highlight how unjust and how problematic the one-child policy itself is. And this position was taken by people who were arguing that we should think of the policy as causing the 失独. They are talking about the couples as policy 失独if they would have liked to have a child or had a child, which then died, and subdivided them and differentiated them from so-called voluntary 失独, so people who forego having a child voluntarily. Of course, that's a smaller group, yeah, in China. And then you have actors in the discourse who are very strongly arguing against such an understanding, basically defending the state against this accusation that it has caused the 失独 problem in the first place, by arguing that, of course, the one-child policy is just the background factor, and it did not cause the death of the child. Yeah, so you have a depoliticization, on the other hand, by actors who are trying to defend the position. Since the lifting of the one-child policy, this has somewhat been toned down. Now the focus is much more on providing support for the 失独. With respect to the 空巢, we also have a kind of tension between politicization and depoliticization. But for the most part, we find that the authors explain the rising number of Kongchao couples by pointing at larger scale socioeconomic transformations that are generally presented in a positive light. So, for instance, they generally understand modernization of agriculture, industrialization, urbanization as giving rise to the quote-unquote problem of the Kongchao. But these larger socioeconomic trends are presented as something positive, which then has a slightly negative social consequence. So they do not say stop urbanizing because it's ripping families apart. Yeah, that we don't find this position, but they are saying, well, urbanization is a natural process. It has to go on. It's part of modernization of the Chinese society, but it has this unfortunate side effect of creating a lot of Kongchao families. And then when they are discussing the micro level of the individuals, interestingly enough, they also are often pointing at the positives rather than the negatives. So they are focusing on self-realization and individual choice as a factor that is bringing about Kongchao situations. They are arguing that, you know, adult children, they need to go out, they need to find their own place in life. And so naturally they leave their families behind and they go to other places. And then the elderly are being left to fend for themselves, which is unfortunate, but it's part of this larger trend of individualization. And it's good for young people or adults to go out and do their own thing. It's interesting that so far we haven't found any study that is pointing at a lack of filial piety on the part of the children causing this situation. And that's especially surprising given the fact that the government in China is now pushing very much this idea of filial piety as a strong foundation based on traditional Chinese culture for family-based care arrangements for the elderly. Looking at the outcomes or the consequences, I again do not want to go into the details of what is being discussed and just focus on how it is being discussed. The focus here is clearly on the negative consequences of both of these phenomena, of the situation of Shidu elderly as well as Kongchao elderly. And in different dimensions. Not every study, of course, touches on everything. Some focus on specific consequences. In economic terms, they are seen as worse off. Their physical and mental health in these two groups is seen as detrimentally affected. In terms of everyday support, they are less well off. They are facing constraints and need to build up maybe self-help groups instead of having family support. And self-help groups are always seen as a second best option at the most. And then you have social and political consequences, which are also usually seen as very negative. So the elderly are more alone, they are left to themselves. Especially in the case of Shidu, there is another complication, namely that it is seen as a kind of stigma. People may not want to hang out with other same-aged elderly because they cannot brag about their children and their achievements. They constantly feel reminded about their loss. At the most, they would like to socialize with other Shidu. There's actually one of the things that we found in the petitions that they wrote, that they wanted local governments to set up eldercare homes just for Shidu without any social contact with other elderly. And in terms of political consequences, the Shidu are often seen as a kind of destabilizing force because of the petitioning, yeah, and because of the potential for unrest. They do enjoy quite some sympathy in the general population, and the government is quite anxious about these protests. What is not being said, again, is highly interesting here. Again, a lot of the studies, the empirical studies that use surveys and data and number crunching, what many of them do not figure in is the question of whether we're talking about individuals or couples. And again, I would argue this is a major difference for all of these dimensions in which we may find negative consequences. And even more damaging from an empirical perspective, many of the studies do not have a control group. So they are sampling only from the Kongchao or only from the Shidu, and then they say, okay, 60% of them have chronic diseases, and that's so bad. Yeah, but without knowing whether this is much more than other people who are not Shidu but in the same age group. Without knowing that, it's really hard to make something out of that finding. Yeah. So, in a sense, these studies, especially those that do not have control groups, they just reify the category instead of really looking at how the category sticks out from the rest of society. So to conclude, I think my time's almost up. We see many overlaps between the two discourses, the one around Shidu, the other one around Kongchao, elderly, but also some clear differences. Starting with the commonalities, both are clearly seen as so-called weak social groups, yeah, that need government attention, that need the government to step up social welfare in various ways. But only the Shidu are really seen as politically, potentially destabilizing. They are the ones that are addressed most under this rubric. The Kongchao are seen as socially maybe a problem, but not as organizing really in terms of protesting or petitioning. Conversely, I would argue that the group character is also much stronger for the Shidu. Yeah. So far, I would say there's a big gap between saying this is a social category that social science academics are using to analyze a social situation, and between a group that thinks of itself as a group. Yeah, so calling them Roshitrinti is already suggesting that they are kind of having these group characteristics, which I would say for the Kongchao, we couldn't find any evidence for that. It's not being discussed. Whereas for the Shidu, yes, there is studies of self-help groups, there is studies of their communication structures that show, yes, these elderly are increasingly seeing themselves as belonging together, and they want to socially distance themselves from others. In terms of population governance, what we can see here is, and that's a larger point I want to make with this paper, by problematizing these particular kinds of aging with the child gone, either due to death or due to relocation, by problematizing these categories and these types of aging, other cases are being normalized. Yeah, so even without mentioning this directly, inherent in this problematization of elderly people who do not have their children around, there is a normalization of ideal care arrangements, namely the elderly living together with their children. That's quite subtle, I would say. It's not stated explicitly, but this is the overall larger impact of creating such a problematized category as the Kongzhou and as the Shidu. So it serves a larger agenda, one could argue, in population governance, namely creating a strong normative guidance for people to stay with their parents, take them in as they need care. And that is exactly what we also found looking at population governance documents, such as the 5-year plans on aging and so on, in this other paper. That is exactly what the government wants. It wants 90% of the elderly to be taken care of by their families. And even beyond that, I want to make another larger point, and that's my last one. I have a feeling that in the social sciences, especially when it comes to social policy and how it is being discussed in China, we often find a certain trajectory of interest, or you could call it a career of a concept, which starts out with some academics calling attention to a new social phenomenon or problem, which then generates a rising interest. You think back to this chart that I showed you. And then everybody jumps in and is talking about this problematic group in society and what their difficulties are and how they should be addressed and so on. And then after a while, people start questioning this social category and they start doubting whether it actually makes much sense because there is so much internal heterogeneity. And then the question becomes, should we really stick to this social category, or should we try to overcome it and go beyond it and no longer use it anymore? For the Shidu, this has already been discussed. That's already part of the trajectory, is already there. For the Kongzhou, we couldn't find it yet. But we're at this point where heterogeneity is being pushed to the foreground. And I think that this is a pattern that we find in many discussions, whether it's on landless peasants or other social categories. The Liushou Ertong would be another category. And that would be my hypothesis. Now, maybe other people would like to go there and see whether that holds some water or not. Okay, but that's a larger point that goes beyond this paper, and I'm stopping on this note. Those are some of the references I mentioned in my presentation. Okay, thank you for your interest, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.